In September 1944, the strategic situation along the Western Front shifted dramatically following the rapid Allied advance across France and Belgium. The capture of Brussels and Antwerp by British forces in early September offered the Allies a critical logistical opportunity, as Antwerp's deep-water port could significantly shorten supply lines for the advancing armies. However, the Scheldt estuary, which provided the only navigable approach to Antwerp from the North Sea, remained under German control. German forces occupied the fortified island of Walcheren, the South Beveland Peninsula, and the Breskens Pocket on the southern bank of the estuary, effectively blocking access to the port. Without clearing the estuary, Antwerp, despite its capture, was unusable for large-scale resupply operations. The German defense in the region was anchored by the 15th Army, commanded by General Gustav Adolf von Zangen. Comprising approximately 65,000 troops, the army included remnants of battle-worn divisions withdrawn from France, reinforced with coastal defense units, Kriegsmarine personnel, and elements of the 64th Infantry Division, 70th Infantry Division, and 346th Infantry Division. Many of these troops, though not at full strength, benefited from extensive fortifications built along the estuary, including concrete bunkers, artillery positions, and flooded lowlands designed to channel Allied movements. These defenses were further supported by batteries on Walcheren, capable of commanding the entire waterway, equipped with 150mm to 200mm coastal guns. For the Allies, the urgency of securing Antwerp's supply route was clear. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group, responsible for the sector, relied on extended overland supply lines stretching back to Normandy, which hindered the tempo of operations as autumn rains slowed transport. The Canadian First Army, under General Harry Crerar, was tasked with clearing the Scheldt approaches, supported by British and Polish units. Their forces included the 2 Canadian Corps, composed of the 2nd and 3rd Canadian Infantry Divisions, the 4th Canadian Armored Division, and attached British and Polish formations, amounting to around 35,000 personnel. These troops, though experienced from campaigns in Normandy, faced significant challenges due to difficult terrain, including dikes, canals, and flooded polders, which restricted vehicle movement and favored the German defenders. Intelligence assessments in mid-September underestimated the resilience of the German 15th Army. Allied planners initially believed that the retreating German units, cut off from their main formations after the collapse in France, would be unable to mount a cohesive defense. However, German command had executed an orderly withdrawal across the Scheldt and the Albert Canal, preserving significant combat strength. These forces, operating under orders from Army Group B, Commander General Feldmarschall Walter Model, prioritized delaying the Allies to buy time for the fortification of the Rhine Line and to protect remaining evacuation routes for German troops withdrawing from southwestern Netherlands. The civilian population of the region, caught between advancing Allied forces and German defensive measures, faced widespread displacement and destruction. Large portions of the Zeeland and Flanders lowlands were deliberately flooded by German engineers to slow Allied advances, rendering villages uninhabitable and farmland unusable. Tens of thousands of civilians fled to avoid combat zones or were evacuated under military orders, while those who remained endured artillery bombardments, food shortages, and the destruction of infrastructure essential to their livelihoods. Public sentiment among the Allies reflected a mixture of optimism and frustration. The capture of Antwerp was celebrated as a major milestone, but the inability to use the port immediately, combined with the growing logistical strain of sustaining armies so far from their supply bases, created pressure on commanders to resolve the Scheldt issue quickly. Among German troops, morale was bolstered by the defensive advantages of the terrain and fortifications, despite their numerical inferiority and the broader strategic retreat elsewhere on the front. For both sides, the estuary represented not only a tactical objective, but a vital logistical and operational asset, whose control would shape the next phase of the campaign in northwestern Europe. By late September 1944, preparations for a protracted engagement along the Scheldt were underway. The Canadian First Army concentrated its divisions for the operation, while German engineers and artillery reinforced defensive lines across Walcheren, South Beveland, and the Breskens Pocket. The stage was set for a month-long battle in some of the most difficult terrain of the Western Front, where control of dikes, canals, and flooded polders would determine whether Antwerp could become the Allies' primary logistical hub for the final drive into Germany. On October 6, 1944, the Battle of the Scheldt began as Canadian First Army units initiated operations to clear the southern approaches to the estuary. The first actions focused on the area known as the Breskens Pocket, located south of the Scheldt on the southern bank of the Western Scheldt, where approximately 12,500 German troops of the 64th Infantry Division, supported by coastal artillery and machine gun emplacements, held a fortified line stretching from Noke to the Leopold Canal. The terrain favored the defenders, with flooded polders and narrow causeways limiting the use of Allied armor and requiring infantry assaults across open, exposed ground. Command of the operation rested with General Harry Crerar, with direct field execution by Lieutenant General Guy Simons, leading the 2 Canadian Corps. Simons deployed the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, supported by artillery and specialist engineer units, to breach the German positions along the Leopold Canal. The opening assault on October 6th involved the crossing of the canal near Moerkerke under heavy artillery preparation. But German defenders, entrenched in bunkers and supported by pre-sighted mortar and machine gun fire, inflicted significant casualties on the attackers. Initial gains were limited to small bridgeheads, which were repeatedly counterattacked by German infantry throughout October 7th and 8th. Further north, the Allies aimed to secure the approaches towards South Beveland by advancing through the southern bank areas and along the Belgian-Dutch border. The British 4th Special Service Brigade, including Royal Marine and Commando units, conducted raids along the coast to disrupt German coastal batteries and gather intelligence on fortifications, while Canadian engineers began preparing amphibious equipment to support later phases of the battle. Luftwaffe activity over the region was minimal, as the German Air Force, severely depleted by autumn 1944, was unable to contest Allied air superiority. RAF and USAAF fighter bombers operated freely, conducting daily sorties to attack German artillery, supply lines, and troop concentrations along the Scheldt. German command, under General von Zangen, relied heavily on natural obstacles and the region's intricate network of waterways to offset the Allies' numerical and material advantages. Units manned strong points along the dikes and flooded areas, with artillery concealed behind embankments to avoid detection. Coastal batteries on Walcheren provided additional fire support, targeting Allied movements on the southern shore and forcing the Canadians to advance cautiously to avoid enfilading fire from across the water. German counterattacks, though limited by a lack of reserves, were launched whenever Allied units established bridgeheads, aiming to prevent a rapid breakthrough that could threaten South Beveland and Walcheren before those positions were fully fortified. Civilians in the contested zones faced growing hardships as the fighting intensified. Many villages along the Leopold Canal and the southern Scheldt were evacuated by force or destroyed in the crossfire, while German flooding of farmland displaced thousands of local inhabitants. Food shortages worsened as supply chains collapsed, and surviving residents relied on improvised shelters and limited Allied relief efforts in areas secured by the Canadians. The widespread inundation also complicated the evacuation of the wounded, as medical units struggled to move casualties across the flooded terrain. Despite the challenging conditions, the Allies steadily expanded their positions along the southern Scheldt by mid-October. Through a combination of concentrated artillery fire, close air support, and methodical infantry assaults, the 3rd Canadian Division secured several crossings of the Leopold Canal, though at a cost of over 1,000 casualties in the first 2 weeks of operations. German losses, while lighter in absolute terms, eroded the defenders' capacity to launch counterattacks, forcing von Zangen to request reinforcements from Army Group B, which were denied due to pressing needs along the Rhine. The opening phase of the battle demonstrated the scale of resistance the Canadians would face as the campaign progressed toward the more heavily fortified areas of South Beveland and Walcheren. Strategic planning for the subsequent phases of the Battle of the Scheldt intensified in mid-October 1944, as the initial assaults against the Breskens pocket revealed the scale of German defenses and the challenges posed by the flooded, canal-laced terrain. The Canadian First Army, under General Harry Crerar, recalibrated its operations to proceed along three principal axes: the clearance of the Breskens pocket on the southern shore, the advance along the narrow South Beveland Peninsula toward Walcheren, and the eventual amphibious and land assaults on Walcheren Island itself. Each axis required distinct logistical preparations and tactical adjustments, as conventional mechanized advances were impractical in areas where much of the land was submerged and traversable only via dikes and causeways. The WW2 Canadian Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Guy Simons, spearheaded the southern operations with the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, supported by artillery brigades, engineer units, and amphibious craft designed for canal and estuary crossings. Preparations included the stockpiling of bridging materials, amphibious buffalo and terrapin vehicles, and prefabricated rafts for ferrying artillery across inundated areas. Air support from the RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Force and USAAF fighter-bomber groups was integrated into the plan, with daily sorties scheduled to suppress German artillery and interdict supply convoys moving between Breskens, South Beveland, and Walcheren. Coordination with Royal Navy units was expanded, as naval gunfire would be required to neutralize coastal batteries on Walcheren once operations there commenced. German strategy, directed by General Gustav Adolf von Zangen of the 15th Army, centered on using the region's geography to delay the Allied advance for as long as possible. The German defensive network relied on three major positions: the Breskens pocket south of the estuary, containing approximately 2,500 men of the 64th Infantry Division; the South Beveland Peninsula, defended by around 15,000 troops from the 70th Infantry Division and supporting units; and Walcheren Island, garrisoned by roughly 1,000 troops, including elements of naval coastal artillery regiments and the 89th Infantry Division. German supply lines were maintained via ferries and barges across the Scheldt and by narrow causeways, all under threat from Allied air and artillery strikes. Despite being outnumbered, the Canadian First Army fielded around 5,000 personnel for the campaign. German forces benefited from entrenched positions and deliberate flooding, which restricted Allied mobility and funneled attacks into predictable corridors. Both sides made miscalculations in their planning. Allied intelligence, though improved since early September, continued to underestimate the cohesion of the 15th Army and the depth of its fortifications, expecting German resistance to collapse more rapidly due to their isolation and attrition elsewhere on the Western Front. This led to ambitious timelines for clearing the Scheldt, which were repeatedly extended as operations bogged down in the inundated terrain. German planners, while effective in leveraging the terrain, overestimated their ability to sustain prolonged resistance given their limited reserves, dwindling ammunition stocks, and the near-total absence of Luftwaffe support. Interdiction by Allied air forces consistently disrupted the delivery of reinforcements and supplies, undermining the staying power of the garrisons despite their defensive advantages. Propaganda played a role in sustaining morale on both sides. German broadcasts emphasized the strategic necessity of holding Walcheren and the Scheldt approaches to deny the Allies access to Antwerp, portraying the battle as a critical stand for the defense of the Reich. Conversely, Allied communiques highlighted the necessity of opening Antwerp to shorten supply lines for the final push into Germany, framing the campaign as vital for accelerating the war's end. This emphasis was particularly significant for Canadian troops, whose government and public viewed their central role in the operation as a defining contribution to the liberation of Western Europe. By October 18th, the logistical and strategic framework for the next phase of the battle was in place. Canadian forces prepared to complete the reduction of the Breskens pocket before pivoting northward, while British units readied to support the advance through South Beveland. Amphibious forces, including specialized engineer and commando detachments, trained for assaults on Walcheren once the approaches had been secured. Both sides anticipated that the fighting would escalate as the Canadians pushed beyond the southern bank into the peninsulas and islands guarding the Scheldt, where German fortifications and coastal batteries were most heavily concentrated. The first major confrontations beyond the Leopold Canal erupted between October 20th and October 26th, 1944, as the Quebec Canadian Corps pushed deeper into the Breskens pocket and advanced toward the South Beveland approaches. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, supported by British and Canadian artillery brigades, launched a series of coordinated assaults against entrenched positions around Oostburg, Schoendijke, and Breskens itself. Approximately 12,500 German troops of the 64th Infantry Division, supported by scattered Kriegsmarine detachments and fortified coastal gun positions, mounted a determined defense despite limited reinforcements and dwindling ammunition. The low-lying terrain, deliberately flooded by German engineers, forced Canadian infantry to advance along narrow dikes and causeways, often exposed to machine gun and mortar fire from concealed bunkers positioned along the embankments. To overcome these defenses, Canadian forces relied heavily on amphibious vehicles and artillery support. Buffalo and Terrapin amphibious carriers transported infantry and light equipment across submerged fields, while field artillery and 25-pounder guns delivered sustained bombardments to neutralize strongpoints. The RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Force provided daily airstrikes against identified German positions, focusing on coastal batteries and supply depots near Breskens, though poor weather and heavy flak limited the precision of some sorties. Despite these measures, progress was slow. German forces launched multiple counterattacks, particularly near Oostburg, where elements of the 64th Infantry Division exploited the constricted terrain to briefly retake sections of the dike before being driven back by concentrated Canadian artillery fire. Simultaneously, preparations for the advance along the South Beveland Peninsula commenced. The British 52nd Lowland Division, attached to the Canadian First Army, began clearing positions along the canal through Zuid-Beveland, supported by Canadian armored units and engineer detachments. German defenses on the peninsula, manned by approximately 15,000 troops of the 70th Infantry Division, utilized a layered system of bunkers, artillery, and minefields to block access to the narrow isthmus leading toward Walcheren. The Allies prioritized securing the slow channel and approaches to the Beveland Causeway, as these would serve as the primary route for ground operations into Walcheren once South Beveland was cleared. Civilian populations in the contested areas endured significant suffering during these engagements. The flooding ordered by German engineers had already displaced thousands, and ongoing shelling and airstrikes destroyed villages and farmland, leaving many without shelter or sustenance. Dutch civilians who remained in the area were frequently caught in crossfire, and Allied medical units recorded rising numbers of civilian casualties alongside their own. Efforts to evacuate non-combatants were hampered by the flooded landscape, where many roads and railways were unusable, and movement was limited to boats and amphibious vehicles. Morale among Allied troops remained steady, but was tested by the slow pace and high casualty rates. The 3rd Canadian Division suffered over 1,000 casualties in October, with particularly heavy losses during assaults across open terrain and at canal crossings. German losses, while lower in absolute terms due to their defensive posture, included over 3,500 killed, wounded, or captured during this period, weakening their ability to hold fixed positions. The lack of German air support was increasingly evident, as Luftwaffe units, reduced to minimal operational strength, conducted no significant sorties to aid the 15th Army, leaving German troops reliant entirely on artillery and fortified positions. By the end of October 26th, Canadian forces had secured most of the Breskens pocket's southern edge, isolating remaining German troops in a shrinking perimeter around Breskens town and the coastal batteries near the Scheldt. The British 52nd Division had advanced to the outer defenses of the South Beveland Peninsula, preparing for a concentrated assault toward the causeway at the Slow Channel. These actions set the stage for the next, more complex phase of the campaign, where the focus would shift to breaching the heavily fortified causeways and crossing into Walcheren, whose coastal guns continued to block Allied access to the vital port of Antwerp. From October 27 to November 3, 1944, the fighting along the South Beveland Peninsula and the final reduction of the Breskens pocket marked the most intense phase of the Battle of the Scheldt thus far. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division continued its systematic advance in the Breskin sector, engaging approximately 5,500 remaining German defenders of the 64th Infantry Division, concentrated around Breskin's town and the fortified coastal batteries at Cadzand and Hoofdplaat. These positions, protected by bunkers, minefields, and pre-registered artillery, were assaulted by Canadian infantry supported by extensive artillery barrages and close-range tank fire, though the soft, waterlogged ground limited the use of armor. Amphibious buffalo carriers once again played a critical role, ferrying troops across inundated fields and enabling flanking maneuvers against isolated strongpoints. After a week of methodical combat, the surviving German forces, cut off from resupply and subjected to repeated air and naval bombardment, surrendered on November 3rd, resulting in over 8,000 prisoners taken by the Canadians in the Breskin's pocket. While the southern shore was secured, attention turned to the South Beveland Peninsula, where the British 52nd Lowland Division, supported by the 5th Canadian Armored Division and Polish 1st Armored Division, advanced along the narrow isthmus toward the Slow Channel. German forces numbering roughly 15,000 troops from the 70th Infantry Division had fortified the peninsula's dikes and towns, utilizing artillery positioned behind embankments and flooding additional lowlands to force the Allies into narrow avenues of attack. On October 28th, the British and Canadians launched a combined assault, supported by concentrated artillery fire and daily RAF sorties, which targeted German gun positions and transport routes. Progress was measured, with gains of only a few kilometers per day, as each dike and village was defended with overlapping fields of fire. The pivotal engagement came at the Beveland Causeway, a 40-meter wide and 1,500-meter long link connecting South Beveland to Walcheren Island. The causeway, heavily mined and flanked by German artillery, represented the only land route to Walcheren and thus became a focal point for both sides. On October 31st, elements of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, reinforced by British commandos, attempted to storm the causeway under covering fire. The initial assault secured a small foothold, but were met by immediate counterattacks from the German 70th Infantry Division, supported by mortars and machine guns positioned on Walcheren's embankments. Fighting along the causeway continued for 3 days, with Canadian units suffering over 300 casualties before finally securing the eastern end on November 2nd. The final crossing to Walcheren, however, would require amphibious landings due to the vulnerability of the causeway to German artillery. Throughout this period, naval and air support intensified as the Allies prepared for the assault on Walcheren. The Royal Navy deployed monitors and destroyers to the Scheldt, using their 15-inch and 6-inch guns to bombard coastal batteries and strongpoints. RAF Bomber Command executed precision strikes on Walcheren's seawalls at Westkapelle, Domburg, and Vlissingen on October 3rd and 7th, earlier in the month, and again in late October, deliberately breaching the dikes to flood the island and neutralize many of the fixed German positions. These actions, while effective militarily, devastated local civilian communities, forcing thousands to flee or endure severe hardship as their homes and farmland were inundated. German command, aware of the inevitability of the Allied advance, shifted to a delaying strategy. Orders from General von Zangen prioritized holding Walcheren's coastal guns as long as possible to deny Allied shipping access to Antwerp, even at the expense of heavy losses. Supply to the garrison became increasingly tenuous, with ferry routes across the Scheldt interdicted by Allied air patrols and naval forces. Ammunition shortages became acute, limiting the ability of German artillery to sustain prolonged bombardments, though their remaining coastal batteries continued to target Allied naval units operating in the estuary. By November 3rd, the Canadians had eliminated the Breskin's pocket and, alongside the British, had driven German forces back to Walcheren Island, setting the stage for the amphibious assaults that would begin the following week. The Scheldt campaign, now entering its climactic phase, was poised to decide the fate of Antwerp's accessibility, with the heavily fortified island standing as the final barrier to opening the port for the Allied advance into Germany. Between November 4th and November 8th, 1944, the Battle of the Scheldt reached its peak intensity as Allied forces launched their coordinated assaults on Walcheren Island, the final German stronghold blocking access to Antwerp. The island, defended by approximately 1,000 troops from elements of the 70th Infantry Division, 89th Infantry Division, and Naval Coastal Artillery units, was fortified with heavy gun batteries, bunkers, and a network of dikes and flooded polders designed to restrict Allied movement. German coastal batteries, equipped with 150 mm and 200 mm guns at locations such as Westkapelle, Domburg, and Flushing, Vlissingen, could target any Allied ship entering the Scheldt, making their neutralization essential before Antwerp could be opened to shipping. The assault began on November 1st with preliminary air and naval bombardments, as RAF Bomber Command conducted targeted strikes to breach Walcheren seawalls at Westkapelle and Flushing. These breaches, combined with earlier strikes in October, flooded large portions of the island, forcing German defenders from some fixed positions, but also complicating Allied movement by turning fields and roads into waterways. On November 2nd, naval gunfire from Royal Navy monitors HMS Erebus, HMS Roberts, and supporting destroyers pounded the coastal batteries, delivering hundreds of shells from 15-inch and 6-inch guns to suppress German artillery before the landings commenced. The amphibious phase of the operation, executed by elements of the British 4th Special Service Brigade, the 52nd Lowland Division, and Royal Marine Commandos, began in earnest on November 3rd. Landings at Westkapelle, heavily defended by German coastal guns and machine gun nests, were supported by naval bombardment and air cover from RAF fighters and fighter bombers. Despite the preparatory strikes, German resistance was strong. Defenders used concealed positions along the dikes and rubble to target landing craft, inflicting heavy casualties during the initial waves. Approximately 4,000 troops in supporting armor were landed on the first day, securing a beachhead but suffering over 300 casualties from artillery and small arms fire. Simultaneous operations occurred at Flushing, where Royal Marine Commandos, supported by Dutch resistance fighters, stormed the harbor defenses under covering fire from British destroyers and Typhoon fighter bombers. Urban combat ensued as German defenders fought from fortified buildings and emplacements, but by November 5th, the commandos had secured the port, capturing or killing over 1,200 German troops in the process. Meanwhile, the 52nd Lowland Division advanced from the Beveland Causeway, crossing onto Walcheren under constant artillery fire, and linked up with the amphibious forces on November 6th, tightening the encirclement of the remaining German positions. Civilians on Walcheren endured severe hardship as the flooding, bombardments, and combat displaced thousands. Entire towns, including Westkapelle and Vlissingen, were inundated or destroyed, forcing residents to seek shelter in attics, dikes, or improvised boats. Casualty reports estimated that hundreds of Dutch civilians were killed during the bombings and landings, while thousands more were left homeless. Allied engineering units began organizing emergency relief efforts even as combat continued, delivering food and medical aid to displaced populations once areas were secured. German counterattacks, though frequent, were limited by ammunition shortages and the difficulty of maneuvering across the flooded terrain. Artillery units conserved shells for priority targets, primarily naval vessels and Allied concentrations along the dikes, but were steadily silenced by coordinated air and naval bombardment. By November 7th, most of the coastal batteries had been captured or destroyed, with surviving German forces withdrawing toward Middelburg, where they prepared for a final stand. By November 8th, Allied forces had secured most of Walcheren's western and southern sectors, capturing over 4,500 German troops and reducing the operational threat posed by the coastal batteries. The fighting, however, was not yet concluded as German forces entrenched around Middelburg and northern Walcheren prepared to resist further Allied advances despite their isolation and dwindling supplies. The operation, now at its height, would soon culminate in the final surrender of the remaining German garrison, ensuring the opening of the Scheldt and the long-awaited activation of Antwerp as the Allies' principal port. From November 9 to November 13, 1944, Allied operations on Walcheren transitioned from large-scale amphibious assaults to methodical clearing actions as the remaining German defenders concentrated in and around Middelburg, the island's administrative center, and along its northern reaches. Approximately 4,500 to 5,000 German troops, drawn from the remnants of the 70th Infantry Division, 89th Infantry Division, and naval artillery units, maintained fortified positions in urban areas, dike lines, and remaining dry ground, relying on heavy machine guns, mortars, and limited artillery to delay the advancing British and Canadian forces. Despite their reduced numbers and severe supply shortages, the defenders exploited the island's flooded landscape and the cover of remaining buildings to mount localized resistance. The British 52nd Lowland Division, supported by Royal Marine Commandos and Canadian detachments, led the clearing operations. Infantry units advanced along the elevated dikes and through waterlogged fields, often using Buffalo amphibious vehicles to bypass mined roadways and reach isolated strongpoints. Artillery support remained constant, with field guns and naval fire from offshore monitors suppressing German strongpoints before infantry assaults. The RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Force continued to fly daily missions, strafing German defensive positions and attacking supply barges attempting to ferry ammunition and reinforcements across the Scheldt. However, worsening autumn weather and low visibility limited the frequency of airstrikes during this phase, increasing reliance on ground and naval firepower. German countermeasures centered on delaying tactics. Small units launched night raids against Allied forward positions, using the flooded terrain to approach undetected, while others attempted to sabotage dikes and bridges to slow the Allied advance further. Despite these efforts, German logistics were nearing collapse. Allied air and naval interdiction had virtually severed ferry routes to the mainland, leaving the garrison with dwindling ammunition and food supplies. Intercepted communications indicated that German commanders on Walcheren were requesting permission to withdraw, but these appeals were denied by higher command, which insisted on holding the island as long as possible to delay the Allies' use of Antwerp. Civilians trapped on Walcheren continued to suffer acutely during this stage of the battle. The earlier flooding caused by deliberate dike breaches left entire towns submerged, and residents who had survived the initial bombings now faced starvation and exposure as combat restricted relief efforts. Dutch resistance networks, working alongside Allied units, assisted in guiding civilians out of combat zones when possible, but many were forced to remain in partially submerged homes or makeshift shelters until the fighting subsided. Reports from Allied medical units estimated that by November 12th, several thousand civilians had been displaced, with hundreds requiring immediate medical care due to injuries, malnutrition, or illness brought on by the flooding and cold conditions. The psychological toll on both sides was notable. For Allied troops, particularly the British and Canadian infantry, slogging through flooded fields and facing persistent sniper and machine gun fire, the campaign's attritional nature was draining. Units such as the 5th Battalion, King's Own Scottish Borderers, recorded casualty rates exceeding 20% during the Walcheren clearing operations, primarily from small arms and artillery fire. For German defenders, morale plummeted as supplies dwindled, and the inevitability of defeat became clear. Desertions increased, with some isolated groups surrendering without resistance once cut off from their main positions. By November 13th, Allied forces had captured Middelburg after a combined ground and amphibious operation. Royal Marine Commandos, supported by Buffalo amphibious vehicles, entered the town from the south and east, bypassing German minefields and cutting off escape routes. Approximately 2,300 German soldiers surrendered during the capture of the city, while others retreated northward toward remaining positions near Veer and the coastal dikes. The fall of Middelburg effectively split the German garrison, leaving the last defenders isolated and marking the final stage of organized resistance on Walcheren. The systematic clearing of these pockets over the following days would complete the island's capture and open the Scheldt fully to Allied shipping. Between November 14th and November 18th, 1944, Allied forces moved to eliminate the last organized German resistance on Walcheren Island, focusing on the northern dike systems near Veer and the remaining fortified positions along the island's inundated interior. Approximately 2,000 German troops, drawn from fragments of the 70th Infantry Division, naval coastal artillery crews, and ad hoc security units, held a shrinking perimeter supported by scattered artillery pieces and machine gun emplacements positioned along the elevated dikes. These positions were tactically advantageous, offering fields of fire across the flooded polders and channels, but the defenders faced acute shortages of ammunition, food, and medical supplies, as Allied air and naval forces had severed nearly all routes for resupply from the mainland. The British 52nd Lowland Division and Royal Marine Commandos, supported by Canadian amphibious detachments, executed a series of coordinated advances to clear these positions. Amphibious buffalo and terrapin vehicles, capable of traversing the flooded terrain, were used extensively to outflank German strongpoints and deploy infantry directly onto dikes and islands of firm ground. Naval gunfire from monitors stationed offshore continued to target remaining coastal batteries and dike defenses, with spotter aircraft from the RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Force directing fire where visibility allowed. Despite these advantages, the narrow dike routes forced Allied infantry to advance under direct observation, exposing them to sustained small arms fire and mortar attacks that slowed progress. German counteractions were increasingly limited to delaying tactics, such as demolishing sections of dikes to create new flooding, laying additional mines along approach routes, and launching sporadic night raids to harass Allied positions. Several of these raids targeted Allied supply dumps and artillery staging areas, causing temporary disruptions, but failing to alter the course of the battle. Interrogations of captured German personnel revealed widespread exhaustion and declining morale, with many acknowledging that continued resistance was aimed solely at delaying the Allies rather than holding the island. Some German officers attempted to organize breakout attempts across the Scheldt by small boats, but Allied patrol craft and air reconnaissance intercepted most of these efforts. Civilians on Walcheren endured further hardships as combat neared its conclusion. The deliberate flooding of the island, compounded by ongoing shelling and the destruction of dikes, left thousands of residents homeless and reliant on Allied relief convoys for survival. Dutch resistance members played a vital role in guiding civilians through the flooded terrain toward Allied-controlled areas, though many were forced to remain in temporary shelters due to the risk of crossing active combat zones. Relief operations, coordinated by Canadian and British engineers, began as soon as sectors were secured, delivering food, potable water, and medical assistance despite the logistical challenges posed by the inundated landscape. For Allied units, the campaign's attritional nature continued to take a toll. Infantry battalions reported steady casualty rates from sniper fire, mines, and sporadic artillery, with some units reduced to half strength after weeks of continuous operations. Logistical strains also persisted, as most supplies had to be ferried across flooded areas by amphibious craft or manually hauled along narrow dikes, slowing the tempo of the final push. Nonetheless, the combination of naval bombardment, air reconnaissance, and coordinated amphibious maneuvers steadily eroded the remaining German defenses. By November 18th, Allied forces had reached the outskirts of Veer, the last significant German position on Walcheren. Encirclement was completed when Royal Marine Commandos, supported by amphibious craft, cut off the final routes along the northern dikes. With ammunition nearly exhausted and their defensive network reduced to isolated pockets, the German garrison prepared for either surrender or a final stand. The stage was set for the conclusion of the battle, as the remaining defenders faced overwhelming Allied firepower and no prospect of reinforcement or evacuation. The clearance of Walcheren was now days from completion, with the opening of Antwerp's shipping lanes imminent. Between November 19th and November 21st, 1944, the final phase of the Battle of the Scheldt unfolded as Allied forces closed in on Veer and the last remaining German strongpoints on Walcheren Island. Approximately 1,500 German defenders, drawn from remnants of the 70th Infantry Division, naval artillery personnel, and local security detachments, held a fragmented defensive line along the northern dikes and in fortified farmsteads around Veer. With ammunition stocks nearly depleted and food supplies critical, these forces relied primarily on machine guns, mortars, and mines to slow the advancing British 52nd Lowland Division and Royal Marine Commandos. The flooded landscape limited their maneuverability, forcing them to cluster on elevated dikes and causeways, which in turn exposed them to concentrated Allied artillery and naval fire. Allied operations during this stage were methodical, designed to avoid unnecessary losses while steadily reducing the remaining German positions. Infantry units advanced along multiple axes, using amphibious buffalo and terrapin vehicles to bypass mined or heavily defended dike segments. Naval gunfire from Royal Navy monitors, supplemented by destroyers operating offshore, targeted German strongpoints identified by aerial reconnaissance, while field artillery on South Beveland provided supporting fire across the narrow waterways. RAF fighter bombers flew limited sorties due to poor weather, but were deployed selectively to suppress pockets of resistance that delayed the advance. German countermeasures had been reduced largely to delaying tactics. Several counterattacks, launched with small groups of infantry on the night of November 19, 20, attempted to disrupt Allied lines along the dikes, but these actions achieved only temporary disruption before being repelled by superior firepower. Attempts to breach the Allied encirclement by crossing the Scheldt in small boats were largely unsuccessful, as Royal Navy patrol craft and air reconnaissance intercepted most escape efforts. Communications intercepts revealed that surviving German officers viewed continued resistance as a means to fulfill orders to delay the Allies for as long as possible, even though the strategic situation on the Western Front made holding Walcheren untenable. Civilians in the Veer area faced worsening conditions during the final days of the battle. Floodwaters from earlier dike breaches had left large sections of the town submerged, forcing residents into upper floors of houses or improvised shelters. Many were cut off from food and clean water, relying on Allied relief once sectors were secured. Dutch resistance networks worked alongside British and Canadian units to guide civilians out of active combat zones whenever temporary ceasefires or lulls allowed, though the movement of non-combatants remained hazardous due to mines and intermittent skirmishes. For Allied troops, the concluding phase of the battle, while less intense than the earlier amphibious landings and causeway fighting, remained costly. Infantry battalions advancing along exposed dikes continued to face sniper and machine gun fire, with casualty reports indicating several hundred losses between November 18th and 21. Engineers tasked with clearing mines and repairing dike breaches also faced frequent hazards, including sporadic shelling from isolated German artillery pieces, and the danger of sudden structural collapses on waterlogged embankments. By November 21st, the British 52nd Division and Royal Marine Commandos had captured Veer and secured the northern dike systems, effectively ending organized German resistance on Walcheren. Approximately 1,200 German troops surrendered in the final 2 days of fighting, with the remainder killed or captured in scattered engagements. The fall of Walcheren cleared the last German-held positions blocking the Scheldt estuary, allowing Allied naval minesweepers to begin clearing the waterway for shipping. With the estuary secured, the port of Antwerp could finally be brought into full operational use, alleviating the logistical strains that had hindered Allied operations since September, and setting the stage for the continued advance into Germany during the winter of 1944-45. By late November 1944, the conclusion of the Battle of the Scheldt transformed the operational landscape of the Western Front. With the capture of Walcheren Island and the clearance of the Scheldt estuary, the Allies eliminated the last German positions, blocking maritime access to Antwerp. The port, one of the largest deepwater facilities in Europe, became fully operational on November 28th after naval minesweepers cleared remaining obstacles and engineering units repaired docks damaged by months of combat and sabotage. This allowed the arrival of the first Allied convoy on November 28th, carrying supplies essential for sustaining the 21st Army Group and other formations preparing for winter operations and the eventual advance into Germany. The battle had lasted from early October to late November, involving approximately 35,000 Allied troops, primarily Canadian, British, and Polish formations, against roughly 65,000 German defenders of the 15th Army. Casualties reflected the difficult conditions and the intensity of the fighting. Canadian forces suffered approximately 2,800 casualties, including killed, wounded, and missing. British and Polish formations added several thousand more. German losses totaled over 4,000, including more than 3,000 captured, with the remainder killed or wounded during the fighting. Equipment losses were substantial on both sides, with the flooded terrain limiting the use of armor and forcing reliance on infantry, artillery, and amphibious vehicles. Strategically, the opening of Antwerp resolved a critical logistical bottleneck. Prior to the port's activation, Allied supply lines extended hundreds of kilometers back to the beaches of Normandy, a situation that slowed the tempo of operations and strained resources, particularly as autumn weather degraded road conditions. Antwerp's capacity allowed the Allies to land thousands of tons of supplies daily, directly supporting operations in the Low Countries and along the German border. This logistical advantage would be decisive in the coming months, enabling sustained offensives despite the German counterattack in the Ardennes in December 1944 and subsequent winter operations. For the German command, the battle marked the effective end of the 15th Army as a coherent fighting force in the Netherlands. Although German units had delayed the Allies for nearly 8 weeks, their inability to hold the Scheldt deprived the Wehrmacht of any chance to contest Antwerp's use. Surviving formations, depleted and lacking heavy equipment, were withdrawn to reinforce positions along the Rhine, where they would face renewed Allied offensives in early 1945. The loss of Walcheren's coastal batteries also eliminated a key component of Germany's ability to disrupt Allied shipping in the North Sea, further eroding their defensive options in the West. Civilians in Zeeland and the surrounding regions bore long-lasting consequences from the battle. The deliberate breaching of Walcheren's dikes and the extensive flooding rendered large areas uninhabitable for months, destroying farmland, infrastructure, and homes. Dutch authorities, assisted by Allied engineering units, began extensive drainage and reconstruction efforts immediately after the battle. But the devastation contributed to widespread displacement and economic disruption in the region through 1945. Thousands of residents relied on emergency aid and faced prolonged hardships as they awaited reconstruction of their communities. The psychological and operational impacts of the battle resonated across both Allied and German forces. For the Allies, the campaign reinforced the effectiveness of combined arms operations integrating infantry, armor, artillery, air power, and naval assets, even in challenging amphibious and inundated terrain. The Canadian First Army, though heavily taxed by casualties and the grueling pace, secured a vital strategic victory that underscored their role in the liberation of Western Europe. For the Germans, the defeat exemplified the cumulative effects of attrition, logistical isolation, and the inability to counter Allied air and naval superiority, factors that would continue to define their defensive struggles into 1945. In historical perspective, the Battle of the Scheldt was pivotal, not only for securing Antwerp, but also for demonstrating the complexity of late-war operations in Europe. It highlighted the importance of logistics as a determinant of strategic momentum, and illustrated the challenges of fighting in environments shaped by deliberate flooding, coastal fortifications, and urban combat. While overshadowed by more widely recognized operations such as Market Garden and the Ardennes Offensive, the Scheldt campaign was instrumental in ensuring that Allied forces had the logistical foundation necessary to sustain their final offensives into the heart of Germany, contributing directly to the acceleration of the war's conclusion in Europe.